Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to hold one idea in your head, because the whole story turns on it. Every meal is a promise with a timestamp. Somebody says food will arrive, and then either it does or it doesn't, and the clock keeps a record whether anybody looks at it or not. Most of us never think about that, but there are about 2.5 million older Americans who eat because a stranger drives a route, and a county pays a contractor, and a piece of paper says it happened. Today's story is about a man who audited exactly those routes for a living, and who came home one afternoon to find a note taped to his grandfather's bedroom door, in his own wife's handwriting. It said she was at a spa week in Europe with her sisters, and that the old man refused to eat anyway, so don't waste groceries. Inside that room was an 87-year-old man too weak to sit up. Here's what I want you to watch for as this unfolds. Not the rage, the patience. Because the thing about a man who works in cold storage is that he already knows the most valuable thing in the world isn't proof. It's the time the proof was written. Dexter Ostrander built his whole career on a boring, unglamorous truth that almost nobody wants to hear, which is that food is not a thing. Food is a schedule. A pallet of chicken leaving a plant in Sioux Falls is safe or dangerous, depending entirely on what the last 9 hours looked like, and the only way to know what the last 9 hours looked like is to have put a logger in the box before the box was closed. Everything Dex did for a living came out of that. He ran a company called Ostrander Cold Works out of a converted refrigerated warehouse on Front Street in Belcourt, Iowa, a river town of 11,000 people in Carrick County. And what Ostrander Cold Works actually sold was doubt, professionally applied. Hospitals hired him. School districts hired him. 3 counties hired him to audit their home-delivered meal programs, which meant that twice a year Dex would show up unannounced at a contractor's loading dock at 4:40 in the morning with a calibrated probe and a laptop, and by 9 he would know whether the trays that were supposed to be leaving at 38 degrees were leaving at 51. He was good at it because he was not in a hurry. That was the part people misread about him. He was a big, quiet, deliberate man with grease in the creases of his knuckles that never entirely came out, and he had the habit of letting a room finish talking before he said anything at all, which more than one person had mistaken for slowness. What it actually was a man waiting for the contradiction. He'd learned it from his grandfather, and he'd learned it in that building, and he'd learned it young because he'd had to. Orson Ostrander was 87 years old in the spring this story starts, and he had built the warehouse on Front Street in 1971 with a bank loan, a used ammonia compressor, and a level of stubbornness that made him briefly famous in 3 counties. He had started as a route man fixing farm milk tanks. He ended up with 60,000 square feet of refrigerated space and a reputation for never once, in 41 years, letting a customer's product go warm. His wife June had done the books at a desk by the window until the day she died, and Orson had never moved the desk. And when Dex was 9 years old and his parents went off the highway on the Carrick County Bridge in February ice, it was Orson who drove to the hospital, and Orson who signed the papers, and Orson who came back 3 days later with a bunk bed in the back of a pickup and put it in the room over the office. He raised the boy in a cold storage warehouse. That is not a metaphor. Dex did his homework on a stack of pallets, learned fractions off a pressure gauge, and spent 1,000 hours listening to his grandfather explain the only philosophy the old man ever articulated out loud, which was this: cold is just time, slowed down. Meat doesn't spoil because of heat, it spoils because of hours. All refrigeration does is buy you hours back. And if you can buy hours, said Orson, you can buy almost anything, but you have to keep the receipt. The receipt was the chart. There was a paper drum recorder on the wall of the old plant room, an inked needle scratching a line on a rotating disc 24 hours a day, and Orson changed that disc every morning at 6 and filed it in a cabinet, and there were 14,000 of them in that cabinet by the time he retired. Nobody ever asked to see one. He kept them anyway. He told his grandson that a man who keeps the chart never has to raise his voice. Elspeth came into the story 11 years before it broke. She was a Quarles, and in Belcourt that meant something specific and not entirely admiring. The Quarles family had lived on the bluff side of town for 4 generations, in a house with a wraparound porch and a mortgage nobody discussed, and Winifred Quarles had raised 3 daughters on the single unbending principle that how a thing looks is what a thing is. Roxanne, the eldest, married a dentist and posted about it. Octavia, called Tavi, the youngest, drifted between jobs and boyfriends and a low-grade guilt she couldn't name. And Elspeth, the middle one, the pretty one, the one with the good laugh, married Dexter Ostrander in a tent on the river in August, and everyone agreed she had done well, and for about 6 years she believed it too. The trouble was that Elspeth had married a warehouse. Dex worked the hours the cold chain worked, which meant 4 in the morning and Sundays and the week between Christmas and New Year's. And he came home smelling like ammonia and diesel, and he talked about temperature. When their daughter Fern was born, Elspeth stayed home for 2 years and then went looking for something that felt like a life. And she found it in an office with good chairs and a coffee machine that ground beans, on the second floor of a renovated feed store, in a company called Havenbrook Senior Nutrition. She was hired as a family liaison. What that meant on the brochure was that she sat down with adult children and helped them enroll a parent or a grandparent in a subsidized home-delivered meal program. What it meant in practice was that she was very good at the 8 minutes in a stranger's kitchen, where a tired daughter with a job and 3 kids finally admits she cannot do it anymore, and Elspeth would put her hand on the woman's hand and say, "Let me carry this part." She was genuinely excellent at it. She came home the first month lit up in a way Dex had not seen in years, and he was so relieved to see it that he did not ask a single question about the company, and he would think about that later, more than he thought about almost anything else. Havenbrook belonged to Thatcher Vandermeer. He was 52, he wore unstructured jackets, and he had the specific charm of a man who has learned that if you ask people about themselves for 90 seconds, they will decide you are brilliant. He had come to Carrick County 12 years earlier from a healthcare staffing outfit that had dissolved in a way nobody could quite reconstruct, and he had built Havenbrook on a single insight. The money in elder nutrition is not in the food, it is in the reimbursement. The county contracted for home-delivered meals under a state and federal funding braid, and the county paid per meal, per client, per day on a submitted invoice. Havenbrook's job was to deliver a tray. Havenbrook's business was to submit the invoice. Thatcher Vandermeer was not a stupid man, and he had built something that looked, from the outside, genuinely good. There were 17 refrigerated vans with a sunrise painted on the side. There was a commissary kitchen with a hairnet policy. There was a Thanksgiving photo op with the county commissioners every November, where he handed out pies, and there was a wall of thank you letters in the lobby, real ones, from real people, because Havenbrook did in fact feed hundreds of human beings who would otherwise not have eaten. That was the genius of it. The fraud did not live where the program was working. It lived in the margin, in the files nobody visits, and it grew there quietly, the way anything grows in the dark. Dex met Vandermeer exactly twice in the first 3 years, and disliked him both times without being able to say why. The second time, at a chamber dinner, Vandermeer had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're the temperature guy," and Dex had said, "I'm the timestamp guy," and Vandermeer had laughed for slightly too long. 2 years before the note appeared on the door, Orson Ostrander fell in his kitchen and broke his left hip. He came through the surgery like a man half his age, and he came home in 11 weeks with a walker and a temper, and everybody in the family understood, without saying it out loud, that a line had been crossed. He could still cook, mostly. He could not shop. He could not stand at a counter for 40 minutes. And the truth that nobody in that house wanted to look at directly was that Dex was working 70-hour weeks on a new 3-county contract and could not be there at noon every day, and Elspeth was working, and Fern was 6. It was Elspeth who solved it, and she solved it beautifully. She sat in Orson's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon with a folder and a pen, and she was warm and funny, and she called him Mr. Ostrander until he told her to stop it, and she walked him through the Havenbrook home-delivered meal program the way you walk a proud old man through anything he doesn't want. 5 hot meals a week, delivered by a person who knocks and waits and says your name. Weekend shelf-stable boxes, a dietitian review. Subsidized to almost nothing because of his age and the county braid. And there was one more form, a short one, and she slid it across last, and she said, "This is just so the county knows who's checking on you." And Orson Ostrander, who had been signing delivery paperwork for 60 years without reading it because he was the one who wrote it, signed on the line that named Dexter Ostrander as his designated caregiver of record. That form carried a stipend, $780 a month, paid to the caregiver of record. Dex found out about the enrollment 3 days later and was so grateful he took his wife out to dinner. He remembered that dinner very clearly afterward. He remembered that she ordered the fish, and that she was quiet, and that when he said, "I don't know what we'd do without you," she looked at the tablecloth and said, "Don't say that." The first 11 months were real. That is the part people never believe when Dex tells it. The trays came. A driver named Jonas Ferrante, 23 years old, knocked and waited and called him Mr. O and stayed 4 minutes too long every Wednesday because Orson would corner him about the Cubs. Orson gained 6 pounds. He started walking to the mailbox. He complained about the salt content of everything he was given, in writing, twice, to the county, in ballpoint, on paper, which Dex would later put in front of a jury. And then in the 12th month, Havenbrook lost the Vandermeer's margin math, and everything changed. The state reimbursement rate had been flat for 4 years, while food cost went up 31%, and Vandermeer sat in his office with a spreadsheet and did the arithmetic that a certain kind of man always eventually does. He could not raise the rate. He could not cut the food much further without somebody noticing. But there was a third variable, and the third variable was whether the meal had to exist at all. He started small, the way they always do. A client goes into the hospital for 9 days. The invoice keeps running. A client dies on the 4th of the month. The file stays open until the 28th. And it worked, and nothing happened, and no one called, and the absence of consequence did to Thatcher Vandermeer what it does to everyone. Within a year, he had a category for it internally, and the category had a name, and the name was maintained. A maintained client was a client whose file stayed open, and whose route stayed billed, and whose trays quietly stopped. It required exactly one thing to be safe. Nobody could be checking. No adult child dropping in. No neighbor. No church. And that meant somebody had to know which clients were alone. That was the family liaison's job. Elspeth did not decide to do it. Nobody decides to do it. What happened was that in a meeting in November, Vandermeer put a slide up about engagement scoring and asked the liaisons to flag which clients had low family touch, and framed it as outreach, as making sure the isolated ones got more attention. And Elspeth flagged 9 names and felt good about it, and 2 months later got a bonus she had not earned by any measure she could point to, and the number was large enough that she did not ask about it. She asked once, in February. She stood in Vandermeer's doorway and said, "Are we still delivering to the Bjelland file?" And Thatcher Vandermeer looked up at her with the warmest, most reassuring face in Carrick County and said, "Elspeth, do you like working here?" And she said yes. And he said, "Then let's not build a problem out of a question." Halvor Bjelland was 91 years old and had been a machinist at the grain terminal for 38 years. He died in his chair in March, and the county file listed the cause as failure to thrive, and Havenbrook billed his account through the end of April. The affair started in April, in a parking lot, over a plastic clamshell of grocery store sushi, which is the kind of detail that makes a thing true. Thatcher Vandermeer had a gift for making a woman feel like the only competent person in a building full of amateurs. He told Elspeth she was wasted on intake. He told her she should be running the whole family services division, and that he was working on it. He asked about her marriage in a way that sounded like concern, and she heard herself describing Dex as a man who loved a warehouse, and she felt disloyal saying it, and she said it anyway, and after that there was no clean place to stop. They used the Rivermark Inn on Highway 61, room 214, on the far side of the county line, and here is where a smart man made his first genuinely stupid decision, because Thatcher Vandermeer did not drive his own car to the Rivermark Inn. He drove a Havenbrook van. It was, in his mind, the safest possible vehicle. Nobody looks twice at a refrigerated van with a sunrise painted on the side. It belongs everywhere. It has a reason to be anywhere. Every one of those vans had a telematics unit under the dash, because the county contract required GPS verification of route completion. The unit pinged every 90 seconds. The data went to a third-party dashboard that Havenbrook paid $400 a month for, and that no one at Havenbrook had opened in 2 years. Dex Ostrander had written the specification for that requirement 3 years earlier, as a consultant, to the county. The summer went by. Orson's trays came 4 days a week instead of 5, and then 3. And then in the second week of June, a young man Orson had never seen dropped a box on the porch without knocking, and after that nobody came at all. Orson called his grandson. He got voicemail, twice, because Dex was in Nebraska for 11 days on a cold chain failure at a school district that had made 400 children sick. Orson called Elspeth. Elspeth said there had been a route change, and she'd handle it, and she came by that Friday with 2 bags of groceries and put them on the counter and kissed the top of his head and said, "I'm so sorry, Grandpa, it's a mess over there right now." That was the first visit. There were 5 more over the next 7 weeks, and Orson counted every one of them, and what he noticed was, because he had spent his life noticing exactly this kind of thing, was that his daughter-in-law never opened the refrigerator to put anything in. She opened it to take something out. His late wife's silver was in the sideboard. The coin books were in the closet. Twice she brought her mother's car instead of her own. By the 3rd week of June, Orson Ostrander understood what was happening to him. He was 87 and he had a walker, and the nearest grocery was 2.5 miles away, and he did not drive after dark anymore, and the boy he had raised was on the road, and he was not a man who called for help. He was a man who kept the chart. So he kept the chart. Inside the door of the cabinet over the toaster, in pencil, in the same 4 and a slash tally he had used to count pallets for 41 years. He marked every day that no food came. He wrote the date beside each 7th mark. He did it in the morning, at 6, the way he had changed the drum charts, and he did it standing up, holding the counter, until the last 2 weeks, when he did it sitting on a kitchen chair he had dragged over an inch at a time. He ate what was there. He ate the chicken soup. He ate the crackers. He ate a jar of green olives over 4 days in the 4th week, and would tell his grandson about it later, with something almost like humor. He drank water and got confused about whether he had already had lunch, which frightened him more than the hunger did, and on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week, he wrote a letter in his own hand on the back of a Havenbrook menu calendar, and then he did 2 more things. He called Zelda Coburn, who was 78 and lived across the street, and had been a school bus dispatcher for 30 years, and could not stop writing down vehicles even after she retired, and he asked her, without explaining, whether she would mind noting down when a Havenbrook van came up Larkin Street. Zelda said she already did. She had 4 months of it in a spiral notebook because she liked the drivers and had been wondering why the Sunrise van stopped coming. And he called Augusta Lindquist. Augusta had done Orson's legal work since 1979, when she was the 2nd woman admitted to practice in Carrick County, and he was the only warehouse owner in town who would give her business. She was 81 and still went in 3 days a week. Orson asked her to come to the house. She came the same afternoon, saw the kitchen, saw the man, and said, "Orson, I'm calling an ambulance right now." And Orson Ostrander, who had not raised his voice in 40 years, raised it. He said, "If you call that ambulance today, she will be here in an hour with a folder and a story, and she will be the one they hand me to." He made her sit down. He made her take a notarized statement, which she took, in her own hand, and had him sign, and which said in 11 lines that he was not refusing food, that no food had been delivered since the 4th of June, and that he was of sound mind and could name the day of the week and the name of the sitting governor. He gave her a photograph of the inside of the cabinet door. He gave her a small gray plastic rectangle the size of a matchbook, and he gave her the Havenbrook Caregiver of Record form, the copy he had asked for and been given 11 months earlier because he was a man who asked for the copy, with Elspeth Ostrander's signature on it, and the stipend amount printed in the box in the lower right. He told Augusta to seal all of it in an envelope, and to hold it, and to give it to his grandson and to nobody else, not to a police officer, not to a doctor, not to a judge, and to give it to him only when he asked for it by name. Augusta Lindquist said, "Orson, you are going to starve to death waiting to build a case." And Orson said, "I'm not waiting to build a case. It's already built. I'm waiting for somebody to be home." The gray plastic rectangle was a temperature and door event logger. Dex had put it in his grandfather's refrigerator 4 years earlier, on a Sunday, as a joke that was also not a joke. He had come home from a conference with a box of demo units, and he had stuck one to the inside wall of Orson's fridge with double-sided tape and said, "Now I'll know if you're eating that garbage bologna." It ran on a coin cell rated for 5 years. It logged internal temperature every 2 minutes, and it time-stamped every door-open event to the second. And it held 18 months of memory before it wrapped, and neither of them had thought about it once since. Orson had remembered it in the 5th week, at 3 in the morning, lying awake and doing what he had always done, which was inventory. He got out of bed. He got to the kitchen. He got the unit off the wall of a refrigerator that held mustard, a bag of shredded cheese, and half a bottle of apple juice, and he sat at the table with it in his hand and started laughing, and could not entirely stop, and then he cried for about a minute, and then he put it in an envelope, because he had spent his entire life understanding that the only thing that beats a lie is a record made before anybody knew it would matter. Elspeth's trip was booked on the 9th of July. The plan, as it was described in the family group chat, was a 7-day wellness retreat outside Lisbon with Roxanne and Tavi, a thing the 3 Quarles sisters had talked about for a decade. Winifred paid for part of it. Roxanne posted about it 4 times before they left. Dex, who was 3 days out of a brutal audit and running on 5 hours of sleep, said go, and meant it, and drove them to the airport in Cedar Rapids at 4 in the morning on a Thursday and carried the bags. Elspeth flew to Lisbon. Her sisters went on to the retreat. Elspeth checked into a hotel in the Kyoto with Thatcher Vandermeer, who had told his own wife he was at a National Aging Services conference in Charlotte, and who had in fact registered for it, and paid for it, and never boarded the plane. Before she left, Elspeth Ostrander drove to her grandfather-in-law's house on Larkin Street. She did not go in. She wrote a note on a sheet from a Havenbrook memo pad in blue ballpoint, and she taped it to his bedroom door, where he would see it from the hall and where anybody who came looking would see it too, because part of her, the part that had gotten very good at 8 minutes in a stranger's kitchen, understood that the story has to be in place before the thing happens. The note said, "At the spa week, with my sisters in Europe. He refuses to eat anyway. Don't waste groceries." Dex got home from Omaha on the 2nd Saturday of the trip, 3 days early, because a compressor had come back online ahead of schedule. He stopped for a coffee. He called Fern, who was at her cousin's. He drove to Larkin Street because he always drove to Larkin Street, and because he'd bought 2 pork chops and a bag of the specific egg noodles the old man liked, and he let himself in the side door at 11:40 in the morning and said, "Grandpa, I've got food," and nobody answered him. The house smelled wrong. That was the first thing. It smelled like a closed room. He saw the note on the bedroom door from the end of the hall, and he stopped and read it twice, and he was still holding the grocery bag. And the specific thing he would remember for the rest of his life is that he felt embarrassed for about 2 seconds. Embarrassed that his wife had had to leave a note like that things had gotten to a place where somebody had to write, "Don't waste groceries," before the second half of the sentence arrived in his brain and every hair on his arms stood up. Orson Ostrander weighed 118 pounds. He had weighed 172 at Christmas. He was on his side on top of the covers in a clean shirt, because he had put on a clean shirt every morning of his life, and his eyes came open and found his grandson, and he tried to push himself up on one elbow and could not do it. He got about 4 inches off the mattress and his arm folded. Dex put down the bag. He would find it there 2 days later, still on the hall floor. He got his grandfather's head up on his forearm. He said, "Hey, I'm here." The old man's hand came up and closed around a fistful of Dex's shirt with a grip that was still, somehow, a working man's grip, and he said the only thing he had been saving up to say for 7 weeks. He said, "Don't feed me. Don't you feed me yet. Get the doctor." Because Orson Ostrander had spent his life reading about what happens to men who are given too much too fast after they have gone without, and he had figured that out too, alone, in that house, and had decided that the last piece of expertise he had left to give his grandson was to stop him from being the one who killed him. Dex called 911 at 11:53 on a Saturday morning. He knows the minute because he has looked at that call log more times than is good for a person. He was on the phone with dispatch, standing in the doorway with the note still stuck to it, when his grandfather pushed something into his palm and folded his fingers over it. It was a strip torn off the bottom of a Havenbrook menu calendar with a phone number on it in pencil, and the old man pulled him down close and got out, in pieces, between breaths, the 4 sentences that would take Dexter Ostrander the next 9 months to fully understand. My lawyer has an envelope, son. Open it before she lands. It's the time. It's all in the time. The emergency department at Carrick Valley Regional took Orson Ostrander back at 12:31, and Dr. Winona Pham came out to the waiting room at 10 minutes to 2 with a clipboard she did not look at once. She was direct in the way that good doctors are when they have decided you can handle it. She said his albumin was 2.1. She said his potassium and phosphate were on the floor, and that this was, counterintuitively, the most dangerous thing in the room. Because the moment they started feeding him, his body would grab those minerals out of his blood to process the calories, and his heart could stop on day 2 or day 3 of getting better. She used the phrase refeeding syndrome. She said they would go slow, 10 calories per kilogram, and correct the electrolytes first, and that it would take days, and that he might do fine. Then she sat down next to Dex, which she did not have to do, and said, "This did not happen in a week. And I have to ask you some questions, and I have to write down your answers, and one of them is going to be about who has been responsible for his food." Dex said, "My wife." Dr. Pham wrote it down. He drove to Augusta Lindquist's office at 6 that evening, still in the same shirt. She was waiting for him with the lights on. She was 81 years old, and she had a manila envelope on the desk in front of her with Orson L. Ostrander, hold written across it in her own square capitals, and a date 7 weeks old. And before she gave it to him, she made him sit down and she said, "I want you to know, I fought him about this, and I lost, and I have been sick about it since June." Then she said, "He told me you'd ask for it by name." Dex said, "He told me it's in the time." She pushed it across the desk. He opened it in his truck in the parking lot because he could not wait, and he laid the contents out on the passenger seat in the order they came out, and the light was going orange over the grain elevators across the river. The first page was the notarized statement, 11 lines, in Augusta's handwriting, in Orson's voice. "I am not refusing food. No food has been delivered to this house since June the 4th. I am of sound mind. I know what day it is. I know what is being done." The second was a photograph of the inside of a cabinet door, printed on ordinary paper, and it took Dex a second to understand what he was looking at. And then he understood, and he had to put his head back against the headrest for a minute. Rows of pencil tally marks, neats in the margin every 7th mark, 49 of them. The third was a copy of a Havenbrook form titled Designation of Caregiver of Record, signed by Orson Ostrander 11 months earlier and countersigned by Elspeth Ostrander, with a monthly stipend of $780 printed in a box in the lower right corner, and a checkbox, initialed, beside the line, "Caregiver of Record attests to weekly in-person welfare verification." The fourth thing in the envelope was not paper. It was a gray plastic rectangle the size of a matchbook with a small silver contact strip on one end and a serial number laser-etched on the back, and Dex Ostrander sat in a parking lot in Belcourt, Iowa, and looked at a data logger he had stuck to the inside of a refrigerator 4 years earlier as a joke. And he started to laugh, and it turned into something else, and then it came back around into laughing again, and he wiped his face with the heel of his hand and said out loud, "In an empty truck, you beautiful old man." Because he understood, finally, exactly what his grandfather had said. It's the time. Not the food, not the wrongdoing, not the note on the door. They can lie about all of that. Everything in this story is somebody's word against somebody's word except for one thing, and that thing is a device that has been writing down what happened every 2 minutes for 4 years without any opinion about it whatsoever. He plugged it into his laptop at his kitchen table at 11 that night and pulled 18 months of history off it, and what came up on the screen was the single most damning object he had ever seen in a career built entirely on damning objects. For 15 months, the chart looked like a comb, temperature riding at 37 degrees, and every day between 11:15 and 12:40, a door event, A spike of 6 or 7 degrees as warm room air rolled in, a little tooth in the line, and then the recovery. Sometimes 2 or 3 teeth. A man living in a house, opening a refrigerator, taking out lunch. On June the 4th, at 11:22 in the morning, there was a tooth. And then the line went flat. Not lower, not higher, flat. 37.1 degrees, undisturbed, a straight ruled line across 49 days. Because nothing was going in, and there was nothing left to take out. And a refrigerator with an unopened door is the loneliest instrument in the world. 6 teeth broke that flat line in 7 weeks. 6 door events. Dex wrote them out on a legal pad. June 6th, 4:41 p.m., open 71 seconds. June 14th, 5:02 p.m., 44 seconds. June 27th, 6:19 p.m., 38 seconds. July 3rd, 4:55 p.m., 52 seconds. July 9th, 3:30 p.m., 61 seconds. July 15th, 5:48 p.m., 40 seconds. 6 visits. Total time the door was open across 7 weeks, 5 minutes and 6 seconds. And the temperature after each one recovered in 90 seconds, instead of the 4 minutes it took when the box was full, because the box was empty, because there was nothing in it with any mass to hold the cold euro, which is a thing only a cold storage man would notice, and which would later be explained to a jury by an expert who was not Dex, using Dex's own methodology, and which would end that trial. Nobody had brought groceries. Somebody had come 6 times and opened the door and closed it. Then Dex pulled the county's Havenbrook billing file for client number 4471, Ostrander O, which he could do in 90 seconds without a subpoena because he was a contracted auditor for Carrick County and had a login he had been issued in 2019. Havenbrook had billed for 35 hot meals and 7 weekend boxes for Orson Ostrander between June the 4th and July the 22nd. Everyone marked delivered. Everyone signed off. 16 of them carried an electronic route verification stamp. Dex sat back in his chair at 1:15 in the morning and did what he had done for 20 years, which was look for the contradiction and then look for the second one. The second one was this. He had written the county's route verification spec himself, and he knew exactly what that stamp was. It was a GPS ping from the van's telematics unit, matched to the client's address within a 100-meter radius, within the delivery window. It was designed to be tamper-resistant. It was designed, in fact, by a man who had assumed the person trying to cheat it would be a lazy driver. If 16 of those meals carried a legitimate stamp, then a Havenbrook van had genuinely been within 100 meters of 1140 Larkin Street 16 times in 7 weeks, and had not delivered anything. He got the GPS. It took him 9 days, a records request, and a very careful conversation with a woman named Lucinda Ravenel. He had found her name by looking up who prosecutes this, and the answer in Iowa is the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. And Lucinda Ravenel was a senior investigator with 19 years in and a caseload of 90, and a phone she answered herself. Dex called her on a Tuesday and did not lead with the story. He led with the sentence that would make her sit up, which was, "I'm a contracted county auditor, and I have a device that proves a client's refrigerator was not opened for 49 consecutive days while the contractor billed 42 meals." There was a pause on the line, and then Lucinda Ravenel said, "Don't touch anything else, and where are you?" She drove up from Des Moines the next morning. She was 56, unhurried, and she had, Dex noticed, the same habit he did of letting people finish. She looked at the logger data for 11 minutes without saying a word. Then she said the thing he had not let himself think yet. She said, "You understand that if this is real, it is not one file." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you understand what it means that it is not one file?" And he said yes, and neither of them said the rest of it out loud, which was that if a company had learned to bill for meals, it did not deliver to people who had nobody checking on them, then somewhere in a county database there was a list of everyone that had been done to, and some of them were dead. Zelda Coburn gave up her spiral notebook without being asked twice. She had 4 months of it: date, time, vehicle, direction. She had noted the Sunrise van coming up Larkin Street 3 days a week through the spring in her small, careful hand, and she had noted the day it stopped, June the 4th, And she had written in the margin, well, because she had been a dispatcher, and dispatchers annotate route change. And then 11 days later, ask Orson. She had also, without any idea what she was doing, recorded every one of Elspeth's 6 visits, with the make of the car and the plate of Winifred Quarles's Buick on 2 of them. And she said, at her kitchen table, with her hands around a cup, I should have crossed the street. I thought about it 4 separate times. I want that in whatever you write down. Lucinda Ravenel wrote it down. Jonas Ferrante came to them. The route driver had been reassigned off the Larkin Street loop in June and given a new manifest, and he had noticed that his manifest had 11 names on it, and his van was loaded with 7 trays, and he had asked his supervisor and been told that some clients were on hold. He asked again in July. He was told to focus on driving. Jonas Ferrante was 23 years old. He made $16 an hour, and he had been photographing his own manifest sheets with his phone every single morning for 5 months, because his supervisor had once accused him of skipping a stop, and he had decided, in the specific stubborn way of a young man with no power, that it would never happen again. He had 140 days of loadout sheets. He had the manifests. He had, without knowing it, a perfect record of the gap between what the vans carried and what the county was invoiced. He drove to the state office himself. He said, I think I've been part of something. Am I in trouble? Lucinda Ravenel told him the truth, which was probably not, and then she told him something else, which was, Son, you kept the record. Do you know how rare that is? The van GPS came back in September. 17 vehicles, 90-second pings, 14 months of history, and it did 2 things at once. The first thing it did was destroy the delivery claims, because when you overlay a van's actual track against the invoices, you can see it. The vans did drive past the addresses. That was the trick. The route was run. The van went by 1140 Larkin Street at 11:35 a.m. 16 times, at 15 to 25 miles an hour, and never stopped. And the 100-meter geofence stamped it as a completed delivery every single time, because Dex had written a radius and not a dwell time, and he would carry that for the rest of his life. The second thing the GPS did, Dex was not looking for. Van 11 spent 3 hours and 20 minutes in the parking lot of the Rivermark Inn on a Wednesday in April, and again in May, and in May again, 9 times between April and July, always the same lot, always mid-afternoon, always Van 11, which was assigned to no route and signed out under the executive account. And on the 9th of July, Van 11 went to the long-term lot at the Eastern Iowa Airport in Cedar Rapids at 3:10 in the afternoon and stayed there for 8 days, which is where Thatcher Vandermeer had left it while he flew to Lisbon with Elspeth Ostrander. Dex looked at that track for a long time. Lucinda watched him look at it. He did not say anything for maybe 2 minutes, and then he said, in a voice that she described later as the calmest thing she had ever heard from a man in that chair, "It's the same data." She said, "I know." He said, "The thing that proves she was cheating on me is the same thing that proves she starved him. It's one file." Orson gave his deposition on the 11th day. He had come up 11 pounds. He was sitting up, his phosphate was still low, and Dr. Pham had said no, twice, and then had watched him argue, and had changed her mind, and she stood in the corner of the room with a crash cart in the hallway, while Lucinda Ravenel's videographer set up a camera at the foot of the bed. He was on that tape for 51 minutes. He said his name and his birthday and the name of the sitting governor. He identified the cabinet door photograph. He described the morning of June the 4th and what he ate in the first week and what he ate in the 5th. He was asked whether anyone had prevented him from calling for help, and he said, "No, ma'am, nobody prevented me. I want to be very clear about that. I chose to wait, and I'll answer for that." He was asked why. And Orson Ostrander looked into the camera, past the lawyer, and said, "Because I have watched this family lose things by being loud. You go loud and they get a lawyer, and the lawyer says the old man's confused, and then they put me somewhere and it's over. I wasn't confused. I had the chart. I've kept a chart my whole life. Nobody ever asked to see one. I always figured that one day somebody would." He was asked if there was anything else he wanted on the record. He said yes. "My grandson didn't know. I want that on there twice." He died 9 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, of a pulmonary embolism, which is a thing that happens to men who have not moved much in 8 weeks, and it happened fast, and Dex was in the room, and the last conversation they had was about whether the Cubs bullpen was going to hold up. There were 400 people at the funeral, which surprised nobody who had ever bought cold space in Carrick County. Elspeth flew back for it. She wore gray, she cried, and it was not entirely fake, which is the part Dex found hardest. She stood at the front of the church with her hand on her husband's back and accepted condolences from people who had known Orson for 50 years, and she said the words that would be read to a jury 11 months later off the transcript of a phone call she made from the church parking lot. It's handled. He's gone. There's nothing left to find. Dex stood in the receiving line for 2 hours and shook every hand. He had known for 6 weeks. He had the logger, the tally photograph, the affidavit, the billing file, the GPS, the manifests, Zelda's notebook, the caregiver form with his wife's signature on it, and 51 minutes of videotape of a dead man explaining exactly what had been done to him. And he did not say one word, because Lucinda Ravenel had asked him for 4 months, and because his grandfather had taught him, in a warehouse, when he was 9, that going loud gives the other side time to get a lawyer. At the reception, in the church basement, Thatcher Vandermeer came through the line in an unstructured jacket and took Dex's hand in both of his and said he was so terribly sorry, and that Orson had been a fixture, and that Havenbrook had been proud to serve him. Dex said thank you. And then he said, "Thatcher, this is a strange time to ask, but you do the harvest luncheon in November, don't you? For the county people." Vandermeer said he did, every year. And Dex Ostrander said, "I've got 60,000 square feet on Front Street sitting empty since Grandpa's retirement. Dock doors, 3-phase, kitchen hookup, room for 200. He'd have liked it used for something like that." He watched the man's face do the arithmetic. You're the optics, the story, the grieving grandson of a local legend handing over the family warehouse, in an election year, with 2 contract renewals pending. Thatcher Vandermeer said it was the most generous thing anybody had done for him in 10 years. Here is what nobody tells you about the 4 months Dexter Ostrander spent living in a house with his wife while the state built a case against her. He was not acting. That was what made it survivable. He did not perform affection he didn't feel, or ask questions he already knew the answers to. He got up at 4. He ran his routes. He made Fern's lunch, and drew a little cartoon on the napkin the way he always had. He said good morning, and he meant it, because Fern was standing right there, and a man who has decided to be patient does not get to also be cruel in the meantime. Elspeth thought he was grieving. She told her sisters he had gone quiet in a way that worried her. She was, in the strange way these things go, kinder to him that autumn than she had been in 3 years, and once in October she came and stood behind his chair and put her arms around his neck and said, "I know you loved him," and Dex put his hand over her wrist and said, "I did." Both of those sentences were true. That's the part people can't hold in their heads. The case grew the way Lucinda Ravenel said it would, which was sideways. They started with Orson and they found 42 more. Carrick, Delham, and Pryor counties. 4 years of invoices, cross-matched against Jonas Ferrante's photographed loadout sheets, and, once the subpoenas landed, Havenbrook's own commissary production logs, because a kitchen that makes 311 trays cannot bill for 384, and food ordering is the one place where a fraud has to argue with physics. The commissary bought protein for an average of 309 meals a day. Havenbrook invoiced for an average of 377. 68 meals a day, 5 days a week, for 4 years. Just over $1,100,000. 43 clients had been maintained. 9 of them had died during the period their files were open, of causes recorded as failure to thrive, dementia-related decline, cardiac event, and in one case, in the county's own records, in a font Dex could not look at for very long, unknown. The forensic accountant traced the flow, county reimbursement into Havenbrook operating into a management services agreement with an entity called Coldwater Provisioning LLC, and Coldwater into 3 places: Thatcher Vandermeer's personal accounts, a consulting retainer paid quarterly to to a company registered to the home address of Delbert Stanhope, who was the Carroll County Office on Aging contracts manager and had approved every Havenbrook invoice for 6 years, and a payroll line labeled Family Services Enrichment that had paid Elspeth Ostrander $219,000 in bonuses over 31 months. Plus, separately, $780 a month, 13 months, paid to a caregiver of record for weekly in-person welfare verification of client 4471, $10,140 for checking on Orson Ostrander. Tavi quarrels broke in the last week of September. She was the youngest sister, the one who had never quite been anything, and she had spent the Lisbon trip at a wellness retreat 40 minutes outside the city, wondering why Elspeth had only appeared for 2 of the 7 days, and why her sister's stories about the spa had the wrong details in them. She came to Dex's shop on a Sunday and stood in the doorway of the office and cried for a while, and then she gave him her phone. The group chat was called Bluff Girls, and it had 11 months of history in it, and it contained, among 400 photographs of appetizers, the following things. Roxanne, in April, is T taking you to the thing in Lisbon, or are we actually going to a spa, LOL? Elspeth, in June, don't ask me about the old man. It's handled. I have it handled. Elspeth, on the 9th of July, from an airport, left a note on his door, so if anything happens, it's on the record that he wasn't eating. D never reads anything. And Winifred quarrels, the mother, on the 23rd of July, 2 days before Dex found him. Is that man still alive? Lucinda Ravenel read that last message in a conference room in Des Moines and put the phone face down on the table and left the room for 4 minutes. Dex did not plan a revenge. I want to be careful here, because he has said this himself and it matters. He planned a room. The state was going to charge it either way. The indictments were drafted by the 2nd week of October, and the grand jury sat on the 4th of November. Lucinda had a date and a plan, and a very ordinary procedure that involved arresting Thatcher Vandermeer at his home at 6 in the morning on the 19th. Dex asked her for one thing. He asked for the 19th to be the day of the harvest luncheon, and for the arrests to happen there, and he told her exactly why, and she said no. He asked again a week later, with a folder. What was in the folder was not vengeance. It was 43 names, 9 of them with a date of death, and a floor plan of a warehouse, and a page of arithmetic. And what Dex said to her was this: you are going to charge him with a number, $1,100,000. And the number is going to be what the newspaper prints, and the number is what he'll plead to, and in 4 years he'll be out and the number will be gone. I don't want the room to see a number. I want the room to see the count. Lucinda Ravenel looked at that folder for a long time. Then she said, I can't stage a spectacle. I can execute warrants at a public location if there's a reason. Give me a reason. He said, every principal will be in the same room, with the county contract officers, and one of them is going to run when the others get taken. Delbert Stanhope has a sister in Florida and a boat. She said, that's a reason. The Havenbrook Harvest Luncheon was held on the 19th of November at Ostrander Cold Storage, 400 Front Street, Belcourt, Iowa, from 12 to 2. 206 people were invited. County commissioners, the Office on Aging, 2 state legislators, the Hospital Foundation, a reporter from the Belcourt Register-Star named Avis Coulter, who had been quietly given a heads-up 11 days earlier by nobody anyone could ever prove. Dex had the building cleaned for 3 weeks. He had the old plant room repainted. He had the refrigeration off, the dock doors sealed, and 140 chairs set out under the original barrel-vaulted ceiling on the polished concrete floor where his grandfather had stacked pallets for 41 years, and the whole west wall was hung with a single 50-foot projection screen, and everybody who walked in said the same thing, which was, oh, this is stunning. There were tables for 206 people, and there were 43 place settings on a raised platform at the front, under a light, in a single long line, like a head table with no head. Each of those 43 settings had a covered plate. Each had a folded card in front of it, and 9 of them had a chair turned backwards to the table. Elspeth arrived at 11:40 in a green dress she had bought for it. She had been happy for weeks. Her husband had come out of his grief and thrown himself into this event with an energy she had not seen since before Fern was born, and he had asked her opinion about the flowers, and she had told Roxanne on the phone that she thought they were going to be okay. Thatcher Vandermeer arrived at noon and worked the room for 50 minutes and was, by every account, magnificent. At 1 o'clock, Dex Ostrander walked up onto the platform in a jacket, with no notes, and the room went quiet and warm, the way rooms do for a grieving man. He said thank you all for coming. He said his grandfather built this building in 1971, with a used compressor and a bank loan. He said Orson had one rule about this trade, and the rule was that cold is just time, slowed down, that all any of us do is buy people hours, and that if you're going to buy hours, you'd better keep the receipt. He said, my grandfather kept the receipt, and he asked the room to look at the 43 settings, and to notice that in front of every plate there was a card, and that on the card there was a name. Halvor Bjelland, Ruby Teasdale, Percival Lamb, Doreen Wexler Ames, Ansel Boothby. He read all 43, and it took 4 minutes and 19 seconds, and there is video of it, and you can hear the exact moment, around name 11, when the room stops being a luncheon. Then he said, under each of those covers is the meal that Havenbrook Senior Nutrition invoiced Carrick County for on the last day that person's file was open. It's the correct meal. We got the menu cycle from the county. It's what the county paid for. He walked down the line and lifted the first cover. The plate was empty. He lifted the second. Empty. He lifted 4 more and left the rest, and behind him, on 50 feet of screen, the first slide came up, and it was not a chart or a number. It was a photograph of the inside of a kitchen cabinet door, and 49 pencil tally marks. He said, my grandfather counted the days. He was a warehouse man. He counted things. The second slide was the logger chart. A comb of little teeth for 15 months, and then, at 11:22 on the 4th of June, a flat line, running 50 feet across a wall, over the heads of 200 people, absolutely level, and Dex stood next to it and put 2 fingers on the flat part and said, this is what nothing looks like. He showed the 6-door events. He said, 6 times in 7 weeks, somebody opened that refrigerator and closed it, and nobody put anything in. The third slide was the GPS track of van 11 at 11:35 in the morning, going past 1140 Larkin Street at 18 miles an hour, 16 times, stamped delivered. And then Dex said, I want to be fair to Havenbrook, because I wrote that verification spec myself in 2019, and I wrote a radius and not a dwell time, and that mistake is mine and I'll wear it. Then he said, that same system logs every van, all the time, including the executive vehicle. And the 4th slide came up, and it was a map with 9 markers on the parking lot of the Rivermark Inn on Highway 61, and dwell times of 3 hours and 20 minutes. And it did not say a single word about what had happened in room 214, and it did not need to. Nobody in that room looked at the screen. 200 people turned and looked at Thatcher Vandermeer. Elspeth was standing at table 9 with a glass in her hand. The last slide was a still frame from a video, an old man sitting up in a hospital bed. Dex said, this is my grandfather, 11 days after I found him, giving a sworn deposition to the Iowa Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. He died 9 days later. I'm going to play you 51 seconds of it. And the room listened to a dead man say, I wasn't confused. I had the chart. I've kept a chart my whole life. Nobody ever asked to see one. I always figured that one day somebody would. Lucinda Ravenel and 11 other people came in through the dock doors at 1:26. Delbert Stanhope was picked up in the north stairwell, 40 feet from the fire exit, which is exactly where Dex had told them he would be. Thatcher Vandermeer stood up and did the thing that men like him always do, which is straighten his jacket and start talking. And he was still talking when they cuffed him behind a table of pumpkin centerpieces in front of 2 state legislators and a newspaper photographer. Elspeth Ostrander was arrested at table 9. She did not look at the investigators. She looked at her husband, across 60 feet of her grandfather-in-law's warehouse floor, and she said one word, loud enough for the people around her to hear it and repeat it later. She said, Dex? And he said the only thing he ever said to her about it, before or since. He said, he asked me to open the envelope before you landed, so I did. The charges came down 11 days later, and they were not small. Thatcher Vandermeer, 91 counts. Medicaid fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and because Iowa attaches an enhancement when the victim of a fraud is a dependent adult, 9 counts of dependent adult abuse resulting in death, which is the charge nobody in that county had ever seen filed before. He went to trial because his lawyers told him the death counts were unprovable. He was convicted on 84 of 91. He is serving 22 years in Anamosa. Delbert Stanhope took a plea in 4 days and gave them everything, including the fact that the arrangement had been his idea in 2018, not Vandermeer's, which surprised everyone. Winifred Quarles was not charged with the fraud. She was charged with witness tampering for a series of phone calls she made in December, and she pleaded to a misdemeanor, and she moved to Scottsdale, and the house on the bluff sold in March. Roxanne was not charged with anything, and lost most of her friends anyway. Tavi Quarles testified for the state. She sat in that box for 2.5 hours and read her own text messages out loud, including her own, and when the defense attorney asked her why she had waited until September, she said, "Because I didn't want it to be true, and I'd like to say that's a reason, but it isn't." Jonas Ferrante's photographed manifests were exhibits 40 through 181. He is now 25 and a shift supervisor and has, framed above his desk, a letter from the Iowa Attorney General. And Elspeth Ostrander pleaded guilty in June to 2 counts of dependent adult abuse, 1 count of Medicaid fraud, and 1 count of theft by deception for the caregiver stipend, and stood up in a courtroom in Carrick County and said the words "allocution requires," which are that on or about June the 4th through July the 25th, she knowingly failed to provide food to a dependent adult in her care, and that she did so for financial gain. She got 9 years. She will serve about 5. Dex filed for divorce the week of the arrest and got sole custody without a hearing. Fern was 8. She is 11 now, and she knows the truth in the shape an 11-year-old can carry it, because her father decided early that the one thing he would not do was hand her a lie to grow up inside, and she visits her mother twice a year, and Dex drives her there and waits in the parking lot and does not say anything about it either way. The warehouse on Front Street is a kitchen now. The June Ostrander Trust bought out the estate and put $400,000 into a commissary and a fleet of 5 vans, and it is run as a non-profit under the name that Fern picked, which is the 43 Chairs Kitchen, and it delivers 1,900 meals a week across 3 counties. Every route runs a door event logger. Every client's family gets a text message with a timestamp when the tray goes down. Every delivery requires a 90-second dwell inside a 30-meter geofence, because the man who wrote the bad spec in 2019 wrote the new one in the spring, and gave it to the county for free, and it is now written into contract language in 14 Iowa counties. And in the front room, in a case on the wall where the old drum chart cabinet used to stand, there is a cabinet door. Just an ordinary painted cabinet door out of a kitchen on Larkin Street, with 49 pencil tally marks on the inside of it and dates in the margin in an old man's handwriting and a small brass plate underneath that says, "He kept the chart." So that's the story, and I want to leave you with the part I keep chewing on. I think most of us assume that if something terrible were happening to someone we love, we'd find out because it would look terrible. It would be loud. There'd be a crisis. And the awful, boring truth is that the worst things in the world are usually happening in a quiet house with the mail picked up and the lawn mowed and a perfectly reasonable explanation taped to the door. Elspeth's note wasn't a slip. It was the whole plan in one sentence, because she understood something that most liars understand instinctively, that if you hand people a story before they ask a question, most of them will take it. Dex read that note, and his first reaction was embarrassment. Not suspicion, embarrassment. That's how well it worked. On a man who audits liars for a living, in the hallway of a house he'd grown up in. The reason Orson beat them is not that he was clever, it's that he was early. He wrote it down while it was happening, before he knew what it would be for, in pencil, on the inside of a cabinet door, at 6 in the morning, when nobody was watching, and there was no audience and no benefit. That's the whole thing. A record made before it mattered is worth 100 witnesses after. So here's the practical part, and I mean this one. If somebody you love depends on a service in a meals, medication, transport, a caregiver, a facility, Ask to see a log, not a promise, not a portal that says everything's fine. Ask for the timestamps, ask for them in writing, and go stand in the room once in a while at a time you didn't announce. It's not paranoid, it's just the receipt. And if you ever get handed a story before you thought to ask a question, slow down, because they can lie to you about almost everything. They can't lie about when.